So welcome to this kind of session on labor, community and housing, negotiating voluntarism, market and the state, which is part of the, if you will, pre-conference virtual panels of this year's SASE meeting, which will take next week, next week. My name is Philipp Degens from the University of Hamburg in Germany, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the Network A on community, democracy and organizations. It is my great pleasure to moderate the sessions, and I would like to thank you for attending, obviously, especially Kathia, Janaina and Marion for presenting, as well as I'd like to thank Joyce Rothschild and Mark Schneiberg for organizing these networks virtual sessions. Before we start actually discussing and hearing the presentations, just a few announcements. The first one is, of course, this, as you just heard, the session will be recorded in order to make it possible to upload it to SASE's YouTube channel. Before this will be done, you will be contacted and asked if you're fine with that in the future. We will have, well, scheduled, we would have like 4 presentations, but I can see only 3.
Quick redeploy because we lost our moderator, and I'm going to step in until Philipp, because now we're 4. Welcome everybody. We have 4 great papers here, 13 to 15 minutes for each presentation. Kathia, do you want to just start, and we'll go from there, and I'll be the timer, I guess. So welcome everybody, and thank you all for coming to this great panel.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for giving us or me the opportunity of presenting a paper that I've been working on with Philipp from Paris-Sorbonne, and that deals with state voluntary services and their position in political economies. Now, the first question you might have with regard to that is, what is a state voluntary service? A state voluntary service is a government-funded program that matches volunteers to host institutions in the nonprofit and public sector for a period of 3 to 12 months, giving them means-tested allowance, some form of welfare assistance, very basic form, and some training. And it all of these state voluntary services, they have mushroomed all across Europe since really the financial crisis in 2008. And it relates back to the trend that Eliasov aptly named politics of volunteering. So the political reframing of volunteering as economic and political resource. You have them really everywhere. Now, given that this is the fact and that we have this reframing of volunteering as a political resource for enhancing social cohesion and so on, we wonder, what does it actually make with volunteering as a practice? And there is an abundant literature that starts to discuss the instrumentalization of the volunteer workforce, also capitalist critique regarding wageless labor or post-wage labor in which volunteers fall. But what we lack yet is a kind of positioning of this typical form of actually furthering volunteering through state action in the political economy of a nation state. And this is what we want to achieve today by comparing especially the German and the French voluntary service, state voluntary service, that are among the biggest and largest state voluntary services in Europe. We therefore borrow on the notion of civic gifts advanced by Elizabeth Clements in her book, Voluntarism and the Making of the American Nation State. And she defines civic gifts as harnessing the infrastructure of civil benevolence to national political projects. Of course, her book spans a much grander historical evolution, which is the making of the American state. But we still think that there are a lot of parallels between her story and what we try to achieve by actually positioning and trying to understand what a state voluntary service actually is with regard to the political economy of a state. And she focuses, as we will do, on the tensions and conflicts as productive sites for the reorganization of the public good. And the type of tension and conflict that we want to look at in this specific paper is the tension between the voluntary part and the service part of a state voluntary service. So there are two, if you so want, historical heritages in the state voluntary service, volunteering on the one hand side, and the idea of a service that comes from the military service on the other hand side. And we want to understand how this tension has been resolved in two different institutional settings, if you so want. And we therefore will use the idea of institutional bricolage to understand what type of elements and templates have been borrowed in those two different countries, which are French and Germany, to make this service fit into, well, the institutional arrangements that are in place. Okay. So with regard to data and method, we aim for a historical comparative case study of the French and the German state voluntary service. We go for a most similar case design because we are dealing with roughly same-sized coordinated market economies that have approximately the same idea about how to handle youth. Youth are really seen as family subjects in both policies areas. And so we expect basically those two state voluntary services to be roughly the same in the actual, or we expect them to position themselves the same way, if you so want, in the political economy. We therefore draw on a document analysis as well as 42 interviews with policymakers, stakeholders, experts in both France and Germany. This is an ongoing study, so every time there's a crisis, we are back with the policymakers, trying to understand what new turn this will take. And the objective here is to provide a comparative and longitudinal study that maps how voluntary work is harnessed and embedded into state action through the means of a service. So I'm going now into the case studies, bringing you the German voluntary service, which really is more voluntary than it is a service. It goes back to a form of military service that had a long tradition of conscientious objection since 1968, which is relatively early in the European Union. And as a result, young and able men who did not want to carry an arm could always go to a non-military civilian service and do their duty there, which meant that they were basically affected to public sector or non-profit organizations that actually lacked labor, such as health and care, and say they constituted a very important labor force for these domains. In addition to that, there was another type of service that was already existent since the 1960s, which was a non-profit, an alternative type of service that allowed actually young female volunteers to be hosted again in institution of the non-profit sector for a period up to 6 months. And over time, it also became more and more expensive. And if you look at the graph that I have put on the right-hand side, you will see that by 2010, those three types of voluntary service roughly mobilize the same number of youth per year. So all in all, we have in Germany by the year 2010, about 250,000 young people who are doing a service, which is a rather big number. And so by 2010, when the Ministry of Defense suddenly decided to suspend the military service, the big question that loomed in the air that no one could really answer was how to compensate actually public organization and health care sector for the loss of their cheap labor. And as a result, they decided, the Ministry of Defense and Family, together those two ministries, to implement a state voluntary service as an educational program. So they would repurpose, if you so want, the civilian service infrastructure. And then instead of matching young and able men doing their service to those host institutions in health and care sectors, they would basically use volunteer force instead. And because there was already a legal template available to actually, legalize and formalize this type of service, given the fact that there was a non-profit sector alternative service that actually did the same thing, they borrowed simply on that. So what you have here is an interesting bricolage where state infrastructure and a legal template from the nonprofit sector are being combined to repurpose something into a voluntary service, if you so want. Since then, We have seen this voluntary service grow. There are about the same numbers of state voluntaries service people doing this, the state voluntary service, as there are people doing actually the alternative service, so about 50,000 on each side. We have actually also interviewed volunteers in host institutions, and they didn't know whether they were doing the one service or the other service. It was interchangeable, if you so want. So we are actually dealing with a very stable niche that that is being seen as an educational program first and foremost. There are some ambivalences and some deviant strategies, of course, that smack of activation, but it's nothing that really troubles, if you want, the working and the functioning of this type of service. Now, let's turn to the French case, which indeed is a very different story, because in France, the military service that existed since the French Revolution didn't have any tradition of conscientious objections. You were young and able, so you went to the service, or you could leave the country if you so want. There didn't exist also any type of non-profit sector, or it's a very young non-profit sector that exists in France, with a very complicated legal status for volunteers. So when in 1997 the president decided to suspend the national military service, there was no need to actually call for an ersatz service of the type we have seen in Germany. What really started to prompt the need for such a state voluntary service were crises that relate back to a malaise of the young people in France. So in 2005, when we had La Crise des Banlieues, which is a situation in France, a very first violent event when the youth in France started to go on the street and claim that they felt ill-treated by the French government. And we are talking here about a youth, about 20% of unemployed youth that have migratory backgrounds and that felt marginalized both politically and economically. This was a nightmare become true for the French government that knew about the problem but never saw this becoming a violent action. And as such, it prompted the need, the idea to actually install such a service to regain some form of social cohesion and further Republican values. So by 2005, a small state voluntary service started to be implemented, and the idea kind of made a career, because in 2007, the presidential election really took up on that idea and started to call for more effectives actually put into place. Yes, Mark.
5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. So in 2007, then with a new president, this small scale service started to become expandable, or they started to expand on this small scale service, providing it with financial infrastructure that would allow really to build up a strong voluntary service with strong alliances, especially to the nonprofit sector, and that would further not only volunteering practices and Republican values, but also employability and social cohesion. And in the framework of this reform, what was also done was to reform the legal aspects of volunteering. So as per 2010, any type of volunteering in France is now codified as a type of service under the code of the military service. So any type of volunteering, if you so want, is part of this military service codex. Since then, the state-funded program of voluntary activity has grown and grown in scale with each new crisis. With each new crisis of the young, basically, the answer of the government was to expand this service program more and more. So in 2015, with the terrorist attacks and the fear of the radical use, it expanded again. In 2020, with the pandemic and the fear of the isolated use, it expanded again. And again now, we are witnessing riots in the streets that are caused again by police violence against young. And we find again this discussion about expanding this service more and more to be able to integrate this this generation, if you so want, of young people into the fold of the Republic institution. So by now we have a state service that mobilizes 150,000 participants per year, which is quite a number for France. Interestingly enough, in France, however, this voluntary service, as you have gathered, is more a service than it is voluntary, because you have a political shift of balance towards the service component of the equation that we are looking at, with a target of this possibly violent unemployed youth. That is one of the main target groups of this type of device, if you so want. But because of the massive expansion of this program, and we see on the right-hand side again this the statistics. This shows you how it has grown in number. We find that there are a few things that started to become problematic with time. For instance, many of the host organizations did not use volunteer workforce before and were not comfortable with this type of relationship. They basically treated them as cheap labor. So this has led to a lot of critique of hidden work within these environments. Also, what we have seen is that although the government increased the number of volunteer contracts over time, it decreased the number of subsidized youth employment contracts it had, so that many of those institutions that we have witnessed started to replace those youth subsidized employment by volunteer contracts, again making this a very ambiguous form of placement strategy, a very ambiguous form of volunteer practice, if you so want. So what kind of civic action is possible in a public organization where people really treat volunteers like a subsidized workforce, you might want to ask? So if we try to come to the conclusion, which is my very goal here, you could say, with regard to the type of bricolage that we are witnessing, that on the German side, you have a bricolage that basically resembles a bit a new wine in old bottles, meaning a new wine, volunteers in old bottles, the old bottles being the civilian service infrastructures that date back to the military service. Also, you have conflicting logics that are resolved more to the voluntary side than to the service side in the German case, with a very stable niche for those for this type of service as an educational program and a few deviant forms of practices. In France, however, you have old wine, which is the unemployed youth, the possibly violent unemployed youth, in new bottles, which is this voluntary service. In this particular equation, institutional equation, the service component is much more important than the voluntary component. And you have here an expensive and expendable tool, which grows with each crisis, if you so want. Every time there's a crisis, this instrument grows and grows in numbers. And it clearly has become, over time, a labor-oriented youth policy. So I think I will stop here, and thank you very much, Mark, for the
excellent. Nice discipline. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Philipp for our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I was kind of cut off for, I don't know what reason, probably the famous German infrastructure and technology. Thanks, Kathia. I encourage all of you to note down your questions, because we will have like a joint discussion at the end of the 4 talks. So the next talk is given by Janaina Saad from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And its title is Labor Market Insecurity and Contemporary Working Class Politics in Brazil. Janaina, the floor is yours.
Great. Let me share here. Okay, wonderful. Well, first, thank you to all of the Network A organizers for putting together this panel, which is a great panel. I'm excited today to present this ongoing research of mine that investigates new types of working class organizations with a focus today on an interesting case from Brazil, the homeless workers movement. And I study how this organization, as well as labor unions, mobilize in the context of high levels of labor market insecurity and informality, as well as labor market fragmentation. So the rise and the consolidation of these non-standard employment relations, as the ILO calls them, which includes outsourcing, intermittent work, temporary contract, etc. And so, so of course, these conditions, they pose considerable challenges for class formation, for organizing workers. And of course, this is not a new idea. A lot of scholars have argued this. So I'll just very quickly go through some of these key challenges. First, of course, is the fragmentation of interests and experiences among workers. Second, of course, organizing at the workplace really is not an option for many of these workers. That their link to a workplace is often tenuous when one exists at all. They are very geographically dispersed, this more precarious segment of the working class specifically, making it very difficult really to bring together these workers. And of course, a lack of organizational resources, which here includes, of course, financial resources, but also just the time to organize. Now, in cases where precarious workers have successfully mobilized into mass movements or mass organizations, scholars have generally subscribe to the idea that, and not exclusively, but generally so, to the idea that these movements and organizations, they tend to be particularistic and narrow in their demands in a way that hinders sort of broader class struggles, right, or broader political struggles. And relatedly, and this comes out a lot in the political science literature, that the poor and the working poor tend to be or engage in more clientelistic relations with the state rather than sort of more broader programmatic relations. And then lastly, and here the work of Marcel Perret recently is very informative on South Africa. A lot of these movements, they tend to be localized and fragmented, although at times quite militant. And so the question, skip the slide. The question that that I ask in this paper is, how do different segments of the working class respond to these challenges of organizing their particular segment of the working class, or challenges of class formation? And then more specifically, do they focus, when they organize, do they focus exclusively on the immediate economic interests of their own members, or do they engage in struggles that benefit the working class as a whole? In other words, the question is that I'm trying to investigate is, to what extent do these organizations of precarious workers have the capacity and, of course, an interest in engaging in class struggle? So to do this and to get at this question, I look at two working class organizations. I studied two working class organizations in Brazil, and here I'll focus mostly on the first one, just because of time. But the first is the homeless workers movement, as I've mentioned, and this is the largest urban popular movement in Brazil. It originated in 1997 as in sort of urban offshoot of the more well-known rural-based MST. It organizes primarily precarious workers and the unemployed. The size of their base is fluid, but currently they organize around 50,000 families. And this number doesn't include the activists and militants that are, of course, involved with the movement, but not in the land occupations that they have. Their strategy for organizing their base are the land occupations. They do large land occupations, mostly in the peripheries of large urban centers. Their collective action repertoire is generally through occupations, roadblocks, and mass protests. Their primary grievance is housing, and their political ties. They've for most of their existence, they have been autonomous, and then more recently, they've established some loose ties with the Socialism and Liberty Party, which is to the left of the Workers' Party. And then very quickly, the CUT is Brazil's largest labor federation, which I also study. They, of course, organize mostly more stable workers in the formal sector, not exclusively, but primarily so. They have a membership of about 4 million workers. This is in 2016. That number's gone down a little bit, and they are affiliated with the Workers' Party. They have close ties with the party. Now here's just so you can get a sense of one of their land occupation, the MTST's land occupations. This is one of their largest ones, which from this vantage point looks quite chaotic and unorganized, but it's actually very interesting for another talk, the way in which the movement organizes these land occupations in a very collectivist, democratic, and solidaristic way. And so, and of course, a quote by one of their militants, which I think is very telling of the sort of class and working class character of this organization, which says, the MTST's political strategy is to organize workers in the peripheries, which historically have remained unorganized in Brazil. So to get at the extent to which these two organizations are able to struggle for broader, engage in broader class struggles beyond the immediate interests of their members, I look at how they respond to two reforms that were introduced in 2016 and 2017 that have a sort of disparate impact on different segments of the working class. So the first one is the fiscal reform, which the Washington Post calls the mother of all austerity plans. It capped government expenditures for 20 years, effectively reducing per capita spending on education, health, social policies. And of course, this impacts primarily informal, insecure workers, the unemployed, those who rely more heavily on the state for their reproduction. And then the second reform is the labor reform, which altered more than 100 points in the existing labor code. It did things like expand outsourcing, regulate intermittent contracts, it favored negotiated practices over those that are legally stipulated, and significantly reduce the power of unions. Of course, this reform impacted mostly those who are in stable employment relations, formal workers, and certainly unionized workers. So there are three hypotheses that really animate this research. The first two have to do with the MTST. the first one is that the MTST doesn't engage with any of these reforms. This sort of indicates that it pursues more of a clientelistic strategy than one that's engaged in broader political resistance. The second hypothesis is that the MTST engages mostly with the fiscal reform and less so with the labor reform, indicating a more particularistic type of politics. And the last hypothesis is that the CUT engages primarily with the labor reform, less so with the fiscal reform, because that impacts their members more directly. So what I do first is I look at the MTST's Facebook platform. It was their main social media platform that they use to communicate these campaigns. And so I look at all of their posts between May 2016 and July 2017. There's about 2,000 posts or so. And I code each post by subject. And we see, when we tally up sort of the total count of posts by subject, we see that the labor reform, in fact, received a greater number of posts than the fiscal reform did. Similarly, the average number of reactions and shares, so how people interacted with those posts, rough measure, shows also no great difference there, in that the labor reform received almost the same amount of reactions and shares on average than the fiscal reform did. In fact, in both cases here, the labor reform actually received more reactions, more engagement, and greater number of posts than the fiscal reform.
3 minutes left.
So. Okay. I'll skip this slide. And then when we look more closely at how these campaigns unfolded on the ground, these are the largest events that took place around the fiscal reform. And I indicate here the involvement of these two organizations in the event, and then on top how large the events were. So we see that the MTST participated in many of the events around the fiscal reform. That means they were actually able to engage their social base. That's kind of what I'm trying to indicate here. The National Day of Strikes on November 11th, they engaged in militant actions. And the national coordinator of the MTST gave speeches, for instance, in the protest on November 27th, in which they took the lead in organizing with more than 40,000 people in attendance. So they had a very sustained participation and engagement with the fiscal reform. The CUT, on the other hand, had very little or somewhat more limited engagement. It was mostly concentrated. The strikes, any work stoppages were mostly concentrated among the education, health sectors that were more directly impacted by the reform. And then when it comes to the labor reform, again, the MTST shows engagement throughout, participating actively in all of the events, sometimes very militantly so, with roadblocks. These events were all much larger in size. And the CUT, on the other hand, did actually manage to rally its base, as well as the labor movement more broadly, around this reform. And in fact, on April 28th, there was the largest general strike in Brazil's history. But then what happened is that some labor federations decided to negotiate with the state instead of pursuing more militant action against these reforms. And so that really weakened the sort of power of the labor movement to resist these reforms. And just to conclude, when we think back to our to the hypotheses. The MIT was actively involved in resisting both reforms. There was really no significant difference between how the movement engaged with the fiscal reform versus the labor reform. And importantly, and I didn't get a chance to really go into this, but I can talk more about it later, that the housing remained top priority for the movement throughout these campaigns, which in a way signals a more sort of more synergy rather than a trade-off between their immediate interests and sort of broader political struggles. The CUT, on the other hand, had a more limited participation in the fiscal reform than the labor reform. And of course, the decision of some of the labor federations to negotiate with the state at the end weakened their resistance, demonstrating they're more of the sort of exclusionary politics, in contrast to the MIT's more solidaristic politics during these campaigns. I will end there. Apologies for the rushed presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you a lot, Janaina, for this very insightful presentation. So we now turn to, without further ado, to David Barkin's presentation. David, great to see you here. It's titled Building Sustainable Communities in the Global South, and David is affiliated with the Universidad Autonoma Metropolitana in Mexico City. David, I turn it over to you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very, very much. My talk is going to be very, very different than the two ladies who preceded me, because I'm going to talk about communities that are actually involved in building alternative societies, and they are living in them. What we're talking about here are a different kind of world than the kind of world that the other speakers were talking about. And we're talking about a world that involves what these people think of as building post-capitalist societies. And it's very, very important to understand that in many parts of the world, and in Mexico, which is the country I'm coming from, we're talking about post-capitalist societies that represent perhaps 25 million people. If we put this into kind of perspective, we're talking about a proportion of Mexican society which is much greater than either the voluntary kind of work of the first paper or the homeless workers' movements that Janaina was talking about. It involves a different view of society. It involves a view of society that sees people as part of nature rather than alongside nature, and that understands nature as something that sustains people, and therefore people have the obligation, and I want to stress that word, the obligation to try to maintain and enrich nature and to collaborate with nature in such a way as to facilitate nature's contribution to improving social welfare. There are lots of different varieties of this approach around the world. I work in Mexico, have worked with people on comunalidad, which is part of the cosmovision of the Oaxacan people. But in other parts, in Chiapas, in the Zapatista world, for example, Lequil, Kush, Lejal is very, very important. But Ubuntu in Africa, Swarak in India, Buen Vivir in the Andes Mountains are all different ways of looking at the same approach with variations that are based upon a very important figure. That is, these societies in general can trace their origins back thousands of years, certainly hundreds of years before the Spanish conquest. And they are trying, but during the period since the Spanish conquest, they have suffered tremendous amount of exclusion, and they still suffer exclusion and degradation of their lands, as the societies in which they live consider them to be obstacles to national economic development, or what I would like to be more obvious about. What I would like to show is that capitalist economic development, which has polarized and destroyed our societies and is now threatening the very stability of the earth, of the planet itself. These are dynamic societies that have a rich collective history, a collective consciousness, and they're working very, very hard to make sure that they can overcome the heritages of the capitalist system in which they were living in which they're still living in. And unlike much of the work that is done in the Society for Social Economics, these communities are generally not interested in interacting with the state, but are moving to live and to operate and to construct on the margins of the state societies, of the state as an institution, and of the government of the societies in which they live. We have coined the term the communitarian revolutionary subject. And the 5 principles of these revolutionary actors, I don't have time in this very small, short presentation to go into it, are autonomy or territorial defense, social solidarity and reciprocity. And I want to emphasize that the social economy involves reciprocity, self-sufficiency, including food sovereignty, but not limited to food sovereignty, productive diversification, because they involve in alliances among communities all over their country, all over the country, but are increasingly involved in international alliances, including a very, very close relationship with the MST, the landless workers' movement in Brazil that Janaina mentioned. And of course, they're all committed to the sustainable management of their lands. The communitarian revolutionary subject is born and reproduced in the community. And I can't stress enough that this is a very, very strong and counterpoint to the individualism of the societies that most of the people listening to this conversation are used to. The community is a part of the whole. The individual is a member of the community, and while she or he may have the opportunity to thrive with as an individual, the responsibility of each individual is to understand and contribute to its role within the community as a whole. And this means something that's very different than what we're used to in capitalist societies, in the Western societies of the people who are here in this seminar, because it means that there is an effort, a deliberate effort to make sure that there is no poverty. That is, no person in the community goes without. And the community has a responsibility to make sure that both its young and its aged people are well taken care of. The revolutionary communitarian subject is also someone, as a community, has a unique ability to generate surplus. I'm not going to go into the term, but unlike the view that the normal social sciences views of these communities have an ability to generate surplus, which is used for strengthening the community as a whole, for ensuring its ability to maintain and rehabilitate its territories, but also, and this is very, very important, to make sure that it can engage in productive opportunities which improve the quality of life of the people living in the community. The surplus...
Sorry to interrupt, just to let you know, 5 minutes left, sorry.
Okay. The surplus is intended to satisfy individual and collective needs, as well as ecological needs, and is used for community transformation. I don't have time to go into the extraordinary basis of one of the inventions of these communities, which dates back some 6,000 or 8,000 years, which is the milpa, which is the maize, the agroecological maize system, which exists in which was invented in Mexico and exists in most of Central Mesoamerica. But it does involve a very, very clear commitment to creating networks, natural networks, which is the agroecological system of the maize complex, but it also involves a very, very important creating of networks nationally and internationally. Mexican communities involved here are very, very much part of an international community, including one of the perhaps most important, which is the Via Campesina. I want to stress that what we're talking about is communities that are strengthening tradition by innovating. And in Mexico, this is a list here of some of the communities that are involved. The Zapatistas, which is the second line here, numbers perhaps 500,000 people. There is a concerted defense of corn, of maize as a cultivator. One of the largest and one of the most solid communities is called Tosepan, which has 250,000 people, with a 40-year history that has just published a book called A 40-Year Plan, Life Plan for the Next 40 Years. And trying to respect the time limits. I will not talk about the way in which, for example, Cherán, the community in Michoacán, has asserted its independence and reclaimed its cultural and economic history through the leadership of an extraordinary uprising of women who have provided the leadership in that community. This is a picture of the Zapatistas in their trip to deepening international solidarity to Europe in 2021. And this collaboration between our university and the communities has involved the production of eggs, cotton, forest management, involves all kinds of innovations that the university can collaborate with these communities, and an interchange of knowledge systems, or it's called a Diálogo de Saberes here in Latin America. And that's very, very important, especially—
just 1 minute left, just to let you know, sorry.
Yeah, especially in a very, very important issue of all of these communities and all of our lives, which is water management. And I have a whole series of other pictures here of the projects that we are collaborating with the communities. I'll leave this slide up for a second to emphasize the international nature of our collaborations with these communities in Mexico and around the world. And at the end, if anyone is interested in this, I can provide them with a bibliography of materials in Spanish and English, which would enrich, I hope, give you some information about this unique approach that deals with people trying to create new kinds of societies on the margin of the capitalist system, rather than trying to reform or make the capitalist system works better. Thank you very, very much.
Great. Thank you, David, for this wonderful talk.